AIIA Victoria is pleased to join the graduate school for this first panel event in the series, which relates in particular to the Master of International Relations students studying here. For those of you who may not be au fait with the Institute, it's a body which since 1928 has been working to promote interest in and knowledge of international relations within the Australian community, and particularly for us here, being with the Victorian branch here in Melbourne. We do this by having a series of lectures and seminars, by promoting research, by working with our youth body Access, and by promoting interest in studying and working abroad. As an example of our programs, which I think may have some synergy for some of the work of the graduate school, the next seminar we have next week is on Somalia, Kenya and Sudan. The following week is on Eurasia and the politics of oil in Europe. And the following week is a session on Vietnam, following a study tour which visited Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. So we look forward to students who, and any of you indeed, who may be interested in our programs. You can find our information on our website. Allow me now to introduce Professor Robin Eckersley, convener of the Master of International Relations program, who will chair this evening's discussion. Robin joined the University of Melbourne in 2002 and teaches in a variety of areas, including international politics, global environmental politics, justice, democracy and difference, and international governance and law. Robin was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia in 2007. Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Les. Thank you, Les, for the welcome, and welcome to all the members of the Australian Institute of International Affairs that might be present tonight, along with everyone else, and also our master's students in the International Relations program. Les, I think, is a good embodiment of where a degree at the University of Melbourne may take you. He was the former ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2005, with previous postings at Jakarta, New Caledonia, New York, Beirut and Lisbon. So we're very happy to have the support of the Institute in this particular function tonight. You're all invited to attend a reception afterwards, which is just upstairs. You can follow the crowd. Those of you who have mobile phones, you may leave them on, but on silent, because you will have the opportunity to Twitter questions during the course of the evening. We will also have the old-fashioned variety of fielding questions, so there will be a roving mic where you'll have the opportunity to put questions to the panellists. Now, before I introduce the panellists, most of you would have seen the advertising for this particular event. There is a very interesting wave of developments happening across North Africa and the Middle East, a wave of democratisation, largely led by a fairly youthful population. We've seen it have some success in Tunisia and Egypt. It's a real struggle in Libya, and we've seen a United Nations Security Council resolution to support and sort of airstrikes to assist the rebels in fighting the Gaddafi government. There's also been a number of efforts in other parts of the Middle East, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Jordan, and in Syria as well. But those efforts so far have been thwarted. So this is a background for us to look at the role of the United Nations in prosecuting this emerging doctrine of a responsibility to protect, to uphold human rights. We're also looking at the way in which that particular intervention has been prosecuted in Libya, but we're also interested in this broader development right across the region. What does that mean for the region, for North Africa and the Middle East? So tonight, to help us ponder these very important questions, we have a panel. First, let me introduce Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, AOQC, who is a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne since July last year. He's also President Emeritus of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, the independent global conflict prevention and resolution organisation, which he led from 2000 to 2009. We also have Professor Hilary Charlesworth, who's flown down from the Australian National University today. She is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at the Australian National University and Director of the Centre for International Governance and Justice in the Regulatory Institutions Network. Further over there, we have Dr. Timothy Lynch, who's joined the School of Social and Political Sciences earlier this year as a lecturer and specialist in American foreign policy and also American politics. He's written many books, one of which is on the US intervention in Iraq in 2003. On my right, we have Mr. Daniel Flitton, who's probably well known to most of you as the diplomatic editor of the Age newspaper. He's also an international relations specialist, a former intelligence analyst for the Australian government, and he's also a university lecturer in his spare time, if he has any. Okay. And finally, we have Dr. Sally Totman, who's convener of Middle East Studies at Deakin University and a specialist in Middle East politics and US foreign policy towards the Middle East. And there's not many people who have written a book on Libya, but we're lucky to have Sally in our midst today because she is one of those people. Okay, so I will start off by asking a few questions to the panellists, and then we'll be open for business from the floor and for those of you who know how to Twitter. So first, let me start with you, Gareth. Someone who's written about the doctrine of responsibility to protect. In your view, do you think Libya is a good test case for the UN to prosecute this doctrine?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real textbook example, both in terms of the case for engagement by the international community and the way that engagement has taken place. Whether it remains a textbook example and will continue to remain so as NATO continues to rather stretch the mandate that has been given by the UN Security Council is something I guess we'll debate. But to begin at the beginning, the responsibility to protect doctrine was embraced by the UN General Assembly at the World Summit in 2005 in a quite sort of spectacular normative shift from what had previously been pretty comprehensive indifference to mass atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, occurring within the boundaries, behind the walls of a sovereign state. Whatever the theory of international law might have been, the practice was one of profound indifference, as we saw spectacularly through the 90s with the experiences in Rwanda and the Balkans in particular. Huge amount of debate, disagreement about how to respond to those catastrophic human rights violation situations. And the whole point of the responsibility to protect was to try to generate consensus around a new way of thinking and acting, which would recognize the primary responsibility to avert these disasters was the state itself. Others had a responsibility to assist the state if it was in a mind to be assisted. But then if a state was unable or unwilling to protect its people from genocide or mass atrocity of other kind, either because it was perpetrating them itself or because it was unable to handle or unwilling to handle groups tearing each other apart, then under those circumstances the international community had a responsibility itself to intervene, to halt or avert the catastrophe in question. So applying that by a whole series of measures, not just military measures, which the debate had been largely about in the 90s, and part of the innovation of the responsibility to protect was to introduce this rather nuanced concept which focused on prevention, long-term, short-term, and also focused on a whole variety of reaction strategies, diplomatic engagement, pressure, intervention, sanctions, reference to the criminal court and so on, that were short of military intervention. So that's the doctrinal framework. That's what we're talking about when we talk about responsibility to protect. I say it was a textbook example in Libya because you had all the preconditions staring you in the face. When those peaceful protesters first started to react following the experiences in Tunisia and Egypt, to demonstrate against the excesses of the Gaddafi regime. They were mown down. There were nearly 1,000 people, we think, killed either in cold blood, on the ground, or from the air by Gaddafi's forces. This is back in February. The international community did react to that. It reacted through the Security Council. For the first time, the Security Council specifically invoked the responsibility to protect principle. It condemned Gaddafi's regime's behaviour, called for a cessation of that violent action, and in order to concentrate Gaddafi's mind, imposed a series of pressure points, sanctions, targeted sanctions, financial, travel and so on against him and his regime, threatened reference to the International Criminal Court for possible crimes against humanity, and it introduced an arms embargo. 3 weeks later, it had become apparent not only that Gaddafi was ignoring that first really quite substantial crack at it by the Security Council, but was continuing to oppress his own people in the areas under his control. And in relation, you remember, to the areas not under his control, Benghazi, he was mounting a major military operation. The tanks were beginning to move, and I think any objective opinion had it that had no further intervention occurred by the international community, within a couple of days, we would have seen a massacre of quite spectacular dimensions, with that perception, I think, being compounded by the fact that you remember that Gaddafi was using the language of cockroaches that he was going to squash. And those of you who can remember Rwanda in '94 will recall that was exactly the language that was used of the Tutsis by the Hutu population that was basically instigating that massacre. So it was a perfectly reasonable anxiety on the part of the international community, quite surprisingly in a sense, because it's always hugely difficult to gather up a constituency, a majority, a non-vetoing decision of the Security Council in these matters. For the first time again, the responsibility to protect principle was again invoked, and this time it was to explicitly support, in UN speak, all necessary measures, which means military action, both in the form of a no-fly zone being enforced militarily, and also in the form of other action, whatever was necessary to stop damage being done to civilian populations in different areas of the country. A very, very open-ended mandate. The only limitation was the Security Council said there can't be an occupying force. The reason for that limitation was clearly that the Arab League, that was a bridge too far for the regional organisation, which was prepared to support an intervention, but not prepared to go that far. And I think the other potential interveners were reluctant anyway to put boots on the ground, as they usually are. So, and of course, it was the Arab League agreement to and support for that intervention which made it politically possible for the US to act, and made it politically impossible for Russia and China to exercise a veto, which they might well have been otherwise minded to do. So we had all these factors coming together. It was a textbook example, I repeat, of a real-life situation exploding in front of everyone's eyes, initial response to it being a measured response, not a crazy military response, doing it through the proper channels, the UN Security Council, getting the proper authorization, and then taking it to the next stage of military action. Of course, what we now have to debate and look at is how that military action is working itself out. It unequivocally, unquestionably stopped a massacre occurring in Benghazi and maybe some other places. And you know, if we forget that, we've lost the plot. But equally, that form of intervention has not been enough to give the rebels enough capacity to actually win a war. Responsibility to protect based military interventions by definition are limited in their scope and their mandate. It's not involving a full-scale war, it's just to stop killing, to stop violence. And the question now is, within the scope of that mandate, will it be possible for this situation to be fully resolved, or are we going to drift into a kind of stalemate and maybe see an excessive use of that mandate in a way which will undermine the credibility of responsibility to protect in the principle, which is one of the things that worries me.
Well, that's a good point to ask another question, and that is, I'll put this one to Tim. It's a kind of a double-pronged one here. The US, of course, is supporting this intervention as a member of NATO. But we know that one of the problems with the Iraq intervention was the lack of a plan B. Here, is it possible to have military intervention and not regime change?
Well, as a matter of historical record, it's possible to do it. And Libya in 1986 would be a case in point where the regime was allowed to continue its in operation after Reagan attacked it. I agree with much of what Gareth has said, but I do find it ironic, ladies and gentlemen, that the same rationale that he applauds for the intervention in Libya was almost exactly the same rationale that was constructed and can be constructed for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Indeed, I would suggest that the human rights condition on the ground in Iraq was far worse for far longer. I mean, these figures are bandied about, but have some robustness. Something like 500,000 Iraqi children died, as per the terms of the UN sanctions regime. And yet when an alliance went in without the imprimatur of the UN Security Council, this was regarded as illegal and illegitimate. But now it's being done with the consent, tacit consent of the Chinese and Russians. Hey presto, we're dealing with a legal, legitimate operation. So I don't query the humanitarian impulse. All I'm asking for is some consistency in how we estimate the legality and legitimacy of both Iraq and Libya.
May I respond to that?
You may.
The only way you can begin to justify military intervention for human protection purposes, as distinct from self-defense purposes or any of the other things that are potentially available under international peace and security, the only way you can do it for human protection purposes, if you've got actually occurring or imminent mass atrocity crimes. That's what this principle is all about.
Half a million children.
What you had with Iraq in 2003, even though it's desperately difficult for the right to accommodate itself to the reality that they had no rationale for intervention there under weapons of mass destruction, under terrorism, or under human rights. What you had under the human rights umbrella in 2003 was a common and garden dictator, a common and garden human rights violator who, by 2003, was fairly indistinguishable from 30, 40, 50 of his counterparts elsewhere. True it was that a decade previously, in the late 80s, he had been guilty of mass atrocity crimes, unquestionably, against the Kurds. True it was that in the early 90s, he had been guilty of terrible mass atrocity crimes, genocidal crimes against the southern Shiites in Iraq. But that was 10 years previously. He was behaving as a tyrant, he was behaving as a human rights violator, thoroughly justifying censure, thoroughly justifying sanctions and all the other political isolation weaponry that the international community can bring. But if you're going to get into the business of regarding it as legitimate to mount a military invasion of a human rights violator who is not satisfying a bar set very high indeed, you are completely denying the capacity to generate any kind of international consensus to deal with a Cambodia, a Srebrenica, a Rwanda in the future. There is a distinction you can weave through this. It's not a matter of loyally, finagling. There's a very clear set of principles here. I fell out with Tony Blair. He was my very good friend before 1983. He knew that I was the guy that more or less invented the responsibility to protect principle, was advocating internationally, and he wanted me to come and speak at a big conference that he was organising just in the run-up to the Iraq intervention to justify what he was doing in human rights terms. And I said then that I did not think it was justified. I say it now, and spoiled a beautiful friendship as a result. So it's an issue that it's very close to my bone, that one, and you've got to steer a course through it.
Okay, so the question of consistency has been raised here. So let me ask you, Daniel, has the Australian government been consistent on this? It was a support of the Coalition of the Willing in Iraq. What are your views of the Australian government's response to Libya? And also, not just the government, but perhaps the opposition and maybe even the Greens.
I think that there's a problem if we make the argument that because you can't act everywhere, you should act nowhere. And I would agree that if you have a very narrow set of principles, I'd cut the cake somewhat differently to the way in which Gareth has done. I would say that when you look at these sorts of interventions, you can look at the purpose. So you're going in to protect a humanitarian, to engage in a humanitarian act or to prevent a humanitarian atrocity. You can look at authority and you can find that through the United Nations. The problem is the means. How do you go about doing it? And I think that that's where real problems arise and real inconsistencies arise. How do you deliver justice on the end of a bomb? And I think if you take it back to what's happened in Australia, there are these very difficult questions that you have to pull apart in this whole idea of a responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention. And I think we saw some of that play out in the run-up to Libya. I think that Kevin Rudd was well out ahead of the rest of the government in terms of advocating for a UN-sponsored no-fly zone compared to the position that the Prime Minister was in. Now, we know that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard get along really well, so I'm sure that they were coordinating closely. But I don't doubt that Kevin Rudd got out in front on that issue, and I think we saw that playing out while Julia Gillard was in Washington. She was advocating for the United Nations to consider it. Mr. Rudd was saying that we should do it. And I think that some of her scepticism was partly because of what her advisors were telling her that they were hearing from the Americans, because it was very unclear in those early days where the Americans would land on this issue, and so they wanted to keep their options open. But I also think it probably reflected some of these debates in the back rooms, which said, okay, if we go ahead and do this, how many planes is it that Australia is going to provide to enforcing a no-fly zone? And the idea of the RAAF buzzing above Benghazi and Libya and in Tripoli would have horrified a lot of the military planners in Canberra. So I think that that's part of the reason why we saw that break. Yeah, perhaps a break is the wrong word, but we certainly saw some division between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister on this, because of those vexed internal debates that were happening. And in the end, of course, Australia didn't provide any planes, but we are now the second largest contributor of humanitarian aid by country to Libya. And there is a lot of debate in Canberra about whether that's actually in Australia's interests and if that's money well spent. Now, Kevin Rudd, I think, is again running the show here, and of course he's the Minister for Foreign Affairs and has also got responsibility for AusAid, so he can direct some of this. But there are debates that also touch on interests versus values, which we haven't really gone into yet. And just to add to Gareth's textbook, if you like, I think the thing here that we don't want to ignore is that Libya is actually fairly easy compared to some of the other problems. Now, we can take the 1,000 number that Gareth quoted earlier. I've seen that number as low as 100. I don't think we know yet. But what we do know is that there are a lot of murders taking place in Syria at the moment. And it is very difficult, and it is an entirely different situation in Syria. And there's no talk about, it's very quickly knocked down, any talk about an international no-fly zone or any sort of intervention, because it's a lot trickier. Syria strategically is a lot more difficult and a lot more important than Libya. So there is an element that goes into the textbook, is this actually doable?
We're going to widen up the discussion shortly to include some of the other countries, but while we are on the topic of Libya, because we have a Libyan expert here, Sally, could you please tell us who are the rebels that are leading this push, and are they likely to be able to produce an effective and legitimate government if they are ultimately to succeed?
I mean, I'm looking into my crystal ball here, obviously, with part of that question. The rebels are made up of, a group of mostly from Benghazi, who are anti-Gaddafi. Benghazi's always had a large population of, I would say, non-Gaddafi supporters. It's a country that's sort of naturally fractured, but they've, I guess, towed the line for quite some time, particularly because of the UN sanctions that were on Libya for such a long time. They had no choice but to kind of hunker down with the rest of the Libyans. But I think what we're seeing is sort of a ragtag group of just average people who are, trying to bring about change. I think the leadership within the rebels is a little bit more suspicious. A lot of them are generals from Gaddafi's army who've sort of seen the writing on the wall and kind of transferred their allegiance over. I don't think they see themselves as being the president of a democracy and running a democratic Libya. Think most of them see themselves as perhaps stepping into Gaddafi's shoes, being embraced by the international community, but running the country very much as a military dictatorship in the future. I don't think that any of them have aspirations towards a democratic Libya. I think the rebels, the average person does, but the leadership doesn't.
Okay, well, while we've got this division between the average person and the leaders, let's break down the average person a little further. Hilary, you're very well known as a human rights advocate and also a feminist and international lawyer. A lot of the pictures we've seen in the press have been of young men, but there have been women in Tahrir Square and other uprisings. So what does all of this mean for women in the Middle East, for women's human rights in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, I'm conscious, first of all, that I'm not an Arab woman, and I think that you'd probably get a different perspective from women on the ground. I actually attended a wonderful seminar last night in Canberra where a number of Arab women spoke of their direct experience, and I think, first of all, certainly the media is slowly, you pointed out, I think, today's age, there is an article on the role of women in the so-called Arab Spring, but women have been extremely prominent. There's, I guess, the cult figure almost of Asma Mahfouz, the young Egyptian woman who encouraged everybody to come to Tahrir Square and so on. But what's striking is that there have been women playing very major roles in even more conservative countries such as Yemen, where you've had women addressing public meetings in what's known now as Hope Square, and a range of women speaking out in Libya, in Bahrain. So it's been sort of quite extraordinary how involved women have been. But my sense is that there's also a fair amount of caution. A lot of women have felt, look, this has been an extraordinary experience to be involved in this, but a bit very, very cautious. I think there's a sense of the memory of Algeria, where a lot of women were involved in the struggle in Algeria in the 50s and 60s, and as soon as Algerian independence came, women were pushed very, very much to the back of the political dispensation and really had no role in forming the new Algeria. So this sense of the failed Algerian experiment for women, I think, is worrying a lot of women. And this is actually, this fear has had some evidentiary basis after the events in Tahrir Square, where enormous attention given to the fact that it was Christians and Muslims and men and women, old and young and so on. When no women, for example, were included in any of the delegations to meet with the Prime Minister or the head of the military, and when the new commission was appointed to draft the interim constitution, there were no women on that. And in fact, a clause promoting women's equality that was in the old Egyptian constitution has now disappeared. So I think there's a real sense that women have been at the forefront, but that they may be real losers in the ultimate political dispensation.
Okay, well, now we've widened out the discussion a little bit. A lot of people have described these developments as a kind of Facebook revolution. Daniel, you're our media expert here tonight. What are your views about that? It's obviously had an extraordinary impact, but perhaps it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I mean, I think protests, I think we can get too caught up with trying to look for elements of the protests which are familiar to us. So a lot of people that are here will probably have Facebook pages, a lot of people that are here might use Twitter, and we look at what's happening in other countries and we think, look, they're using Facebook, they're using Twitter, so they must love it and it must be really influential and important. And I'm a little bit sceptical about that. I mean, protests have been around a lot longer than Twitter and Facebook. And not to be the dinosaur of the deadwood things that we print our paper on each day, but those sorts, that sort of rallying that took place through the old newspapers and pamphlets pamphleteers that used to be on the street corners, it was perhaps a little slower. But it certainly helped to organise protests in the past. What I think is different is where Twitter and Facebook is important is in terms of some of the organisation. I think that there are some elements of these things that just get people riled up and excited and certainly help to escape the sort of state organ media which has been so controlling. But you mentioned double-edged sword. I mean, in a lot of ways, the state can use these same sorts of technologies to clamp down on the protesters, to find out where they are, to find out where they're organising, to find out who the leaders are. So there's that aspect to it. There's also a lot of disinformation that can be passed around on these things. And it's very hard to rise above the din. I mean, if you've ever sat there and you look at a hashtag which is popular, perhaps on Monday night if you're watching that ABC Q&A show, or I did this early on during the Iran protests. I sat there one evening on the computer and it just happened to be at the time where the young woman Nada in Iran was shot in the neck, and the video of her, which was very gruesome and very graphic, became viral very quickly. But in terms of actually being able to sit back and understand, I didn't actually get a lot out of the Twitter. It was like trying to take a drink of water from a fire hydrant with your mouth open and all the water's just streaming in. There's just too much. So I still think that a lot of the, what you might call traditional media, was needed to distill and to give context to what was happening. And I would actually think that from afar, one of the most influential channels in all of this has actually been Al Jazeera. If you look around in the Middle East, satellite dish on every rooftop, Al Jazeera beaming in, particularly in Egypt, with stories about Mubarak's corruption and the bank accounts overseas. Similarly in Libya, I think that that's really where some of the power lies.
Well, thank you. Speaking of social media, I've been looking for some Twitter coming in through here, and it's all very blank. So we might just, because that's not because people may not be twittering. Something's paused and stalled on my little laptop here. So let's take some questions from the audience. I know there are some roving mics. Could you put your hand up, those with the roving mics? Oh, down here, okay. We have a question just here, the gentleman with the glasses. Try and use it as an opportunity to put a question rather than have a long soapbox comment.
I've heard a theory that there wasn't actually the capacity for Gaddafi's forces to engage in a massacre in Benghazi because his forces would have been stretched too thin over the desert. And if that's the case, isn't there the argument that we were just getting involved in a civil war? And if so, why would we get involved in a civil war?
Gareth, this one's for you.
Well, I think if that had been the view, that there was no serious risk to the civilian population of Benghazi, it would have been inconceivable that the Arab League would have supported a measure as strong as it did in the Security Council and been able to persuade Russia and China and the others to go along with that. There's been a little bit of sort of second guessing afterwards by all sorts of people blocking away and saying, what massacre, how do we know there was ever going to be a massacre, so on and so forth. I mean, perfectly true, there was a pretty long supply line that would have had to be maintained but there was no no-fly zone or anything else in place then to make a mess of that supply line. And we've seen from the resilience of the Gaddafi forces, even under very substantial NATO attack over the last few weeks, that these guys have got a lot going for them militarily. I just get all these things when something doesn't happen. I mean, how do you make a totally confident prediction that it would have without the intervention occurring? But overwhelmingly, the evidence is that there was going to be something really pretty horrible. I mean, the best account I've heard, someone that puts it in context. Someone said to me in an international meeting, I was like, but probably it would have only been 1,000 or 2 people executed, and probably only about 10 or 20,000 people imprisoned. I mean, what's the fuss? Well, if that's the sort of frame of reference you're going to apply, what are we about? There was obviously going to be shelling of civilian unprotected positions. There was obviously going to be major deaths. What sort of numbers we're talking about, I don't know, but it was going to be serious.
But aren't we now involved in taking sides in the civil war?
Yeah, well, pretty much, I guess we are, and this is the dilemma that you're in, because you can continue to stop mainly through strikes and missiles and so on, further concentrated military attacks on other finite, definable places. But how do you stop Gaddafi dealing oppressively with people in Tripoli under his own areas? How do you ensure that he doesn't use different guerrilla-type tactics which don't involve mass concentrations of military and actually do a lot of damage in the process? It's a very, very difficult issue to deal with, and that's why the NATO exercise of the mandate has been creeping up, and why they're now talking quite overtly about regime change, knowing perfectly well that they didn't get their mandate at the beginning to do regime change. They got their mandate to stop killings and massacres and to do some equalisation of the situation and give the rebels a chance, but that was about all it was. But there's a not unreasonable argument that if you are in a situation where civilian protection is not manifestly going to be able to be guaranteed without change at the top, then it is possible to argue fairly logically that regime change, while it's not the primary motive, is an incidental consequence of your exercise of that primary motive. But it's fragile ground politically, and my worry is that if this goes, the ideal solution would be to go back to the Security Council and say, this is no longer a pure civilian protection situation, it's an international peace and security situation on which the Security Council should give a different and broader mandate. That would then sort of solve the conceptual problem. The problem is there's no political will to do that, so we're stuck in this kind of twilight zone at the moment. My own view, just finally, is that I think the kind of pressures that are being mounted are still very considerable. Because military stuff is not the only game in town. There are the sanctions, there is the possible reference to the criminal court, there is the kind of pressure that's being mounted on the regime that very, very often in similar situations has led to a crumbling from within over time. Sometimes it hasn't been quick, sometimes it's taken months and months, but it can actually happen. The relentless military pressure combined with these other forms of pressure, I think still gives us a pretty fair chance that over time, Gaddafi will in fact crumble. But it's a tough line ball situation at the moment.
I know Hillary would just like to come in on this point.
I just want to ask a follow-up to Gareth. I mean, then what do you make of Syria? Because one of the things that's often said about R2P, you've described it, this is a perfect storm, if you like, it's applied here. Basically, the real reason why it applies here is not so much the facts, it's because you've got the politics of the Security Council right. I mean, as Daniel was saying, that Libya is an easy target, but Syria is much more complicated. The US has been watching its cues very, very carefully there. And I noticed the Russian ambassador recently to the UN said, we don't want to get involved in Syria because it's a civil war. But surely that it's going to weaken R2P if one uses it just when it seems good because you have everybody wanting to dump on a particular country, but you're not doing it when it's really hard politically.
Well, what is it? I mean, R2P is not military intervention, it's not humanitarian intervention. R2P is doing whatever it takes to stop a situation occurring, and if you can get to that result by political intervention, diplomacy of the kind that Kofi Annan did in Kenya in 2008, without any military intervention, stopped a comprehensive Rwanda-type massacre occurring. If you can get to it by threatening International Criminal Court prosecution, if you can get to it by targeted sanctions, you're still applying R2P. And frankly, the stars are going to align only very rarely indeed to enable you to do the military option. And the biggest single problem in Syria, apart from all the double standards and hypocrisy and double talk that goes on, the biggest single problem is that the Arab League, the neighbours, are not prepared to give any kind of support for military intervention in Syria in the way they were for Libya. And no Western government could possibly, any more than Obama could possibly, or the Brits or the French could possibly have gone into Libya without that regional support, because you just lay yourself wide, wide open to the allegation in the whole Arab Islamic world that you're back to your bad old crusading habits. And, that's just part of the politics of it, and we've got to be realistic about it.
Tim, I know you'd like to come on this one too.
Well, it's an observation more than an argument, and I'm not saying it simply to provoke debate, but I'm always amazed at the faith that my fellow panellists, perhaps Gareth especially, place in institutions like the Arab League. He speaks about the Arab League as if he takes them seriously. He speaks about the UN Security Council as if it embodies international legitimacy. These are vehicles for power calculations. When interventions happen, as a matter of historical record, you can take the Cold War as your case study, the interventions happen because the United States is prepared to sponsor them, to lead them. The exceptions are actions that are undertaken under a UN umbrella. So if you're looking for, solutions to genocide, and obviously we've heard there is a solution in Libya which wasn't applied in Iraq, and I still don't buy that argument at all. The notion that this can only happen once you've got the Chinese and the Russians and this thing called the Arab League on your side strikes me as not just wrong, but historically amnesiac. It's power that counts in international relations and international affairs. And no amount of international legitimacy, no amount of international legal doctrine and transnationalism and pooled sovereignty can get over that fundamental fact.
Well, that's pretty good in an undergraduate class, but it doesn't go down too it does not go down too well in the real world. In the real world, you do what you've got to do. In the real world, you look back, I hope, with horror at the number of occasions when those power realities have played out and allowed things like Cambodia to occur and allowed Rwanda to occur. Of course the Security Council is a flawed institution, but the Security Council is getting its act together.
Absolute nonsense.
And the evidence of that is exactly the way it's behaved in Côte d'Ivoire and exactly the way it's behaved in Libya. Because you had a conjunction, you've had a conjunction of both legality and legitimacy coming together. Whether it's sustainable is a very good question. I'm anxious about that myself. But my God, progress is possible. We've been witnessing it. The number of conflicts we've seen around the world, just get that in your head, Tim. In the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, has diminished by something like 80%. And that
do
is
with
certainly
international law.
partially attributable to the end of the Cold War, certainly partly attributable to the end of decolonisation. But there's been a phenomenal upsurge in international activism, including institutional activism, peacekeeping and all the rest of it through the Security Council, regional organisations, engaged governments. We're not wasting our time when we do this stuff. There's going to be disappointments, there's going to be bumps, there's going to be lurches, there's going to be reverses, there's going to be inconsistencies. But we're not wasting our time. The alternative is to go back to the jungle.
Okay, we'll stop it. I want to just move things on in a slightly different direction here. We do have a question here from Mirza, which is, what will be the response of the West if the Arabs reject democracy and tend to choose a system that they're more accustomed to and which is at odds with democracy? Sally, can I put that one to you? And you might, along the way, tell us a little bit about how things are travelling in Tunisia and Egypt.
Okay. I don't know what whoever it is, Musa or whatever, thinks that the current system is. I mean, if you're talking about dictatorships, then I think that a lot of the countries that have had these people's uprisings probably don't want a military dictatorship. But I guess they don't want a Western-style democracy either. There can be, an Islamic democracy. There's nothing wrong with that. It might scare the West.
Sketch that out for the audience.
An Islamic democracy might be, I won't say like Iran, but that's a good example. They have free and fair elections, but perhaps they have a religious leader overseeing things, perhaps more like...
Free and fair elections, did I hear?
I would say that they have free and fair elections. I know perhaps in the West that's not a popular thing, but they do have, elections where people do get to vote. They do get to vote for the party. It's, perhaps more free and fair than the election where George
If you dig
W.
underneath the
Bush
surface, it's not quite as it seems.
Put it this way, we said that what happened in Iraq was free and fair elections in the last round. That was less free and fair, and it took 9 months to resolve, and Maliki got into power, God knows how, since he didn't win the majority of the popular vote. But we deem that to be free and fair. So using that criteria, I would say that Iran has a free and fair...
As in, who's
the
the
West.
deeming? The West.
I'm talking about us as the West, the United States in particular, probably. But the Australian government, said that what happened in Iraq was free and fair elections. So by that yardstick, I'm saying that Iran is as well.
Okay, that's an interesting yardstick. Any more questions from the audience at this point? How about right in the middle there?
I'd be interested in getting the opinions of the panel members with regards to what they think the role of Islamic fundamentalism may play in the coming sort of months as these changes are taking place. Whether they think it's as big a threat as some have made it out to be, or they don't think it's as that much of a threat.
Daniel, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. I don't think we know, I think is the answer to this. I think what we've seen happen in all of these different countries has been a story for each of these different countries. There's obviously some unifying aspect, some sort of pan-Arab aspect to it, but the motivation for the different protesters in the different countries has been different. It's been an odd mix of nationalism, some sort of even less, more community organised, a lot of anger about the treatment that people have suffered under fairly odious regimes. Not a lot of anger yet directed towards the supporters of some of those odious regimes, which has been a lot of Western governments over a long time, and we'll wait to see how that unfolds. Certainly there has been a religious dimension to it, and we know that some of the religious groups have been some of the better organised, but it's been interesting to take Egypt, for instance, how the Muslim Brotherhood has actually held back through the protests and felt that if it had too much of a role, perhaps it might have had people turn against it. But certainly they've been there, and their presence is being felt now in the aftermath. And I see, just to be the daily reporter, that the protesters are back on the streets in Tahrir Square just today. And we just still don't know how these things are going to unfold. I think in Tunisia it was protests for differing reasons, and Libya very quickly sort of spiralled into a civil war for some of the reasons we've been talking about tonight. Don't know really what's going to happen in Yemen, don't know what's going to happen in Oman. I'm watching Saudi Arabia. I think that the confluence of events, we've got a very old king in Saudi Arabia, and geez, if he happened to drop dead in the next few weeks, a succession would be really difficult. And the way in which people organise, we just don't have much insight into those sorts of connections. So I'm not concerned personally that this is going to end up with a bunch of Islamist regimes, but I do think it deserves to be watched.
Okay, I have another question here. This one's directed to Tim. It says, has intervention in Libya and pressure on Mubarak redefined Obama's foreign policy?
Well, in some ways, what Libya suggests to me is the fundamental continuity you have in US foreign policy. You remember Barack Obama when he was the great liberal hero in 2008, and he was going to do everything that was opposite of what George Bush would do. He would heal the world, the climate would cool, people would learn to love the United States again. And yet within 2 years, much in the same way as George Bush, he has attacked his Muslim state. He's using very much the same rationale that George Bush used, that Bill Clinton used, that Bush Sr. used in doing so. His intervention in Libya should be seen as part of a continuum of an American foreign policy, which when you look, actually shows a marked bias towards interventions on behalf of Arab and or Muslim interests. I could go back to the non-intervention in Suez, where America deserts Israel. You could go to George Bush's senior's intervention in Kuwait, liberating a Muslim state from a secular tyrant. The Balkans, Kosovo, when the United States bombs a Christian civilization in defense of an ethnic Muslim population, up through the interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. So in some ways, Obama, despite this contention that he would tread a far more realist, realpolitik line, has actually fallen into line with everything his three predecessors have done.
Gareth, would you care to respond?
Well, I mean, the motivation that's unquestionably led Obama to intervene in Libya was not the kind of mindless cowboy motivation that led George W. Bush Sr. into Iraq. It was not the human rights dimension of Iraq that motivated Bush and the Americans in 2003. It certainly motivated Blair far more than the WMD issue. But for Bush, it was WMD plus avenging Daddy and God knows what other psychodramas you want to identify. And plus the general sort of muscularity and the need to reassert. I mean, this was a deeply debated thing in the Obama administration. It's perfectly true. There was a tension between the realpolitik and the idealists. I mean, Tim's right about that sort of characterisation running through a lot of this. And certainly in the Libya context, I mean, Gates and the heavy-duty realists were deeply reluctant to go in there, and Obama was basically persuaded by people like Samantha Power, who'd written the big book about genocide and the abdication of responsibility by the US in the past in the 90s, and was genuinely moved by that. I mean, but being a cautious politician, he wasn't going to go crusading on that basis. Wrong word, but he was not going to go intervening on that basis. He was going to make very sure of the political landscape and the way that he went there. But I have to say the best single thing about recent events and Osama bin Laden and so on is that it has given Obama a boost again in domestic popularity, and we are dealing here with someone who is genuinely hugely intelligent and hugely decent values about this stuff, and hugely balanced, I think, in the judgment that he brings to it. And I think it's a much more sophisticated, nuanced brand of foreign policy we've seen from Obama working itself out through these different situations. And I think there are some real discontinuities from US foreign policy in the past.
It may be all that, but it's exactly the same foreign policy. We may privilege him because of his exotic background and his supposed intelligence. His foreign policy is exactly the same as George W. Bush's. In fact, in some ways, it's a more competent execution of the Bush doctrine.
I'm not sure that's exactly right, because what was it Harold Macmillan said? Events, dear boy, events. And I think that what we're confronted with at the moment, I think that in a lot of ways Obama has been a very deeply disappointing president, but it was because he very deliberately set out to inflate people's expectations, because don't forget he had a very difficult road to fight in order to just win the nomination. I mean, that thing with Hillary Clinton played out for a long time. So domestically, he was fighting to blow up a bubble of expectations so that he could overcome the Clinton juggernaut, which we all assumed was going to be the nominee. And in order to do that, he built up this sort of people's expectations. He went off to Berlin and gave the speeches and he did all this sort of stuff. And then at the end of it, he's very much trying to deflate the balloons of expectations. And that has disappointed a lot of people. I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if he's not able to run the same sort of campaign in 2012 and raise the same sort of money that he did in 2008. You know, $1 billion through the Twitters and the Facebooks and all that sort of stuff through that social media, because he excited a lot of young people who now look at him with some disappointment for some of the reasons that Tim's been saying there. But I think in terms of events, what's been happening in the world is very different, and the world is changing very much in the last few years. The Americans are very conscious of what's happening in our region, for instance, and I think that the Americans have really been absent from Asia, and they're starting to wake up that Asia's where the game's going to be in the years to come.
Okay, another one from the floor. Just here. Just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear the question.
Press something? No. That democratisation in Libya is unlikely to happen with the rebels not being very democratic, and if Gaddafi stays, him not being very democratic. Are there any other countries in the region where the upheaval is now going on where you believe democratisation is sort of an option for the future?
Sally, this is clearly you, yes.
I think it's an option everywhere in the future. I just wouldn't want to put a time frame on that. Even in Egypt, I think that the process is very slow. I think that's why protesters are out on the street again, because there's been no real change. It's still basically everybody except Mubarak and family who are making the decisions. The military commanders are all the same. So the people running the show really haven't changed. The same in Tunisia. The events that are happening in Yemen and Syria at the moment are perhaps worth watching, because if those governments fall, we might see wholesale change, because there's no one under Bashar al-Assad to hold on to the reins if he goes. The Ba'ath Party will collapse probably, but he'll probably hold on. That's the flip side of the coin. There's a lot of unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, which I don't do very often. And I don't like to use my crystal ball too much.
Just very, very quickly, look north from Australia at Indonesia. The sort of democracy that Indonesia has built in the last decade or so has been pretty remarkable. There's a hell of a lot of problems still up there. But the transition that Indonesia's made from the Suharto regime from 1998 to now, so say 13 years or so, to now, has been pretty remarkable. And if something like that happens in Egypt, and I'm not saying it will, but if something like that happens in Egypt, then that would be to the good.
Okay, one more question from the audience. Just there, yes.
Thank you very much. Just I came late, and hopefully my question has not been covered. And my perspective is based on South perspective, not North perspective. We understand Condoleezza Rice said we wanted to export democracy to the Middle East, but it didn't work. It was just a few years ago. But it worked now without support or intervention from the West. So why it didn't work when America supported or offered it, and it worked now? That's one point. The second question is...
Make this the last. You're supposed to only have one question.
And the second one is America did not support at the beginning, at least in the case of Egypt. It was very skeptical, and particular, and also Israel as well. Democracy is good for Americans and for Israelis, but also it's good for the Middle East. So why they didn't support at the beginning? Why they so skeptical?
Should I take that one?
Yes.
I think that your first question relates to why democracy didn't work before. I think democracy is a grassroots movement. It needs to come from the people. You can't impose it top down. So I think that what we're seeing now is a grassroots movement, which is perhaps why it'll have more success. In terms of the US's hesitancy to support, I guess, the revolution or the uprising in Egypt, is that Mubarak was a really good ally. He'd had peace with with Israel for 30 years. He kept that border safe, and he was the second largest recipient of US foreign aid in the Middle East. And so I think that relationship meant that they were going to see if he could hang on, and if he could, they would prop him up. When the writing was on the wall and it looked like he was going to fall, they realised that they had to, make a pragmatic decision, and that's what they did.
Also because the Americans of the West generally have had this exaggerated horror of Islamic fundamentalism, which is why they're propping up Mubarak and so many others against what they thought would be, and why they reacted as they did when Hamas won a properly conducted election in the Gaza Strip. I mean, I think this is wildly exaggerated generally in answer to the earlier question. There's different streams. I mean, most practitioners of Islam are not activist at all. Those who are, most of them, they divide between the missionary activists and the political activists, Muslim Brotherhood, and only a tiny, tiny minority are the crazy jihadi, violent activists. And even the democratic activists. I mean, yes, you've got a spectrum of those who would cheerfully apply the most repressive forms of Sharia law, but there are plenty of others who, in terms of their particular brand of democracy, have not got a cloth ear to the sentiments of the young generation. And I think it's just terribly, terribly distorted an awful lot of the characterisation of these movements and these Islamic-focused movements that's going on in North Africa and the Middle East.
Can I just add to that? I think that that's a really good point, and that probably only less than 1% of Muslims I would describe as extremist. But the same can be said for Christians and Jews. There's nutters everywhere. Every group has a minority that's fringe. I think that, perhaps the Western perspective is that we think Islam has more, which isn't true.
We've pretty much run out of time. I'd just like to put one final question to Hilary about the role of the UN here. The Security Council, but perhaps more broadly, what do you see the UN's proper role in this broader region, and not just Libya?
Of course, the UN is only as good as its members. And the idea that there's it's its problem. It's
anybody can be a member. That's
yes, but also especially
you have selective membership of the UN.
Well, you already have that, Gary.
You have a democratic.
Okay, well, we're just hearing from Hilary at this point. Thank you, gentlemen.
I think that it's easy. So somebody once said of the UN that the tragedy of the UN is that it became indispensable before it became effective. And I think that's very true. I think we're seeing that at the moment in the Middle East, because in a sense, one of the debates between Tim and Gareth has been over the value of the Security Council, and I actually think that we can overestimate. I think it's a happenstance that we have a galaxy that is now approving some measures using R2P. But as a lawyer, speaking as a lawyer here, it's deeply worrying. I don't think you can argue, as people like Ramesh Thakur have argued, for example, that R2P is now a legal principle. I don't think we're anywhere near. I think it's a highly political principle, and it's one that's being undermined by its very inconsistent application, inevitable, but inconsistent application. So I think the UN here, I think the really valuable sort of parts of the UN actually relate to one of the earlier pillars of the responsibility to protect, the idea that the international community has a duty to support populations in countries. So not the military stuff, we put far too much emphasis on that. I think a huge role in education, a huge role in other forms of support. So I actually think the UN is deeply involved. We tend to look at the Security Council. The UN is actually through UN Women, the new arm of the UN devoted to women, through UNICEF, through UNESCO, through a whole other parts of the UN, through the ILO indeed, are doing really valuable work that just doesn't attract any attention at all.
That is a more positive note on which to end, and I'm sad to say we do have to end now because we've run out of time. But those of you who want to retrace any of this argument, you will find it available on our website. There will be a podcast, I understand, that will be made available. And without further ado, I invite you all to join us upstairs for drinks, which will run up until about 7:15. And finally, I'd like to thank all of our panel members, those who've travelled interstate and those who've come locally, for a very stimulating discussion, and also for you coming out on a very wet and wintry night. Thank you.